Hello everyone, and thank you for joining APQC's webinar, How Process Frameworks Drive Organizational Success. As a reminder, audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are muted. This is the Q&A tool located on the right of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them here and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording in a few days. I would like to introduce the speakers for our webinar today. We have APQC's Process and Performance Management Principal Research Lead, Holly Lycogland, along with APQC's Process Classification Framework Product Manager, Melissa Krappel. Holly, take it away.
All right, thank you, Madison, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We're really wanting to kind of explore process frameworks and how people use them within their organization. So every couple of years here at APQC, we do a large project looking at process classification frameworks. So how are people using them? What roles do they play? What kind of value do they bring to the table? And that's kind of what we want to talk to you today about, is the research that we've done recently on this topic. More particularly, we want to focus on, so what is those top applications, or how are people actually applying frameworks? What are some of the common adoption challenges, or where do people struggle with adoption and implementation when we're talking about frameworks and process work? Also looking at some of the results and some tips and advice on how we've seen people address those challenges. And finally, what are some of the common components of business process management and process frameworks that really help us make sure that our programs are providing the most value for the business possible? So with that, we kind of wanted to start off with looking at how are people using those process frameworks.
Hi, everybody. This is Melissa, and we're wanting to understand and getting an idea of how people are using the framework. And to that end, we need to kind of address what is the process classification framework. And put simply, it's just a common language that a taxonomy of process elements that allows for an organization to be able to communicate effectively across the organization and across departments and across silos, what work is being done and how that is defined.
Thanks, Melissa. And I think another way we also see people look at it, and for this we're talking about APQC's PCF, but also in the study we covered frameworks in general, kind of also including things like ETOM and ITOL and things like that. But really their purpose is kind of a laundry list of those activities, so people can then take them as a reference and build them and use them for all of those things Melissa talked about. Kind of to that point though, we wanted to kind of level set with all of you and really kind of understand, so how are you guys using process frameworks? So as we get that poll launched here, so for you guys, are you using a process framework primarily for that discovery and standardization? So using it as a reference to wrap structure around how work's getting accomplished in your organization? Are you using it for improvements? So you can help identify and manage opportunities to make sure that work goes more smoothly, or you're able to improve performance in different parts of the organization? Are you using it for technology implementation? Say you're rolling out a new ERP system, or you're trying to develop some robots and some automation, and you want to make sure that the processes are being executed appropriately within those. Are you using it for content management? So collating all the information that people need as they execute work in one place, so that training and all of the business rules and stuff is clear cut for people involved in the organization? Or are you using it for benchmarking, so that you can compare what practices other organizations are doing, or just benchmark and see where you stand compared to your peers as far as your performance measures go? So as we're getting some of those in, I'll leave it open here for another few seconds.
A lot of people are submitting right now, Holly, so I'll close it out here in a few seconds.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
Looks like we've got a majority of the votes, so I'm going to go ahead and close it and share the results for you to look at.
So it looks like almost half of you are looking at it specifically for that structural purpose. We're trying to create some structure about how work gets accomplished, also establishing that common language, like Melissa talked about a minute ago. So making sure as we're doing the same activities, they mean the same thing to people. And then followed shortly by kind of the second most common application, which is performance improvements. So great, excellent. So what we're going to do now is actually compare what you guys said to what were some of the responses then by the survey takers.
And you guys seem to be very much in line with our survey takers. The vast majority use the framework for process discovery and standardization, as well as managing their process improvement efforts as well.
Right.
And that's then closely followed by technological implementation, content management, and benchmarking.
I'll say that almost looks exactly like our poll results. So as far as kind of given the time, we really wanted to just then focus on those top two applications, right, Melissa?
Correct.
All right, so let's kind of see what we mean by these broad categories and what are kind of those applications within them.
So as you see, organizations use the framework for process discovery. Generally, it's used to identify current processes, build process maps and models, to develop end-to-end processes so you get an understanding of what's going on within the organization, and then to create process definitions. So once you have what it looks like, processes look like, then you can start defining those processes. And what this does is allow for an understanding of where work is currently being performed and to identify process redundancies and to identify process improvement opportunities, which is the second most utilized reason for the PCF. And what that allows is management and support of continuous process improvement efforts. And this is achieved through the creation of process performance dashboards. This allows for establishing and implementing process metrics to ensure that improvements align to organizational goals. Because with that alignment, you really can't begin to effectively establish and continue processes, and you can, through those performance metrics and the dashboard, start doing auditing on the processes that you have.
That's it. And we've seen a lot of organizations kind of take the process work they've done in the beginning, so getting all their maps together, developing their BPMN dashboards, as you said, so they can start drilling in on performance and making objective decisions about what's, outside of variance, or what's, rated important as far as what the organization is looking for in those dashboards to help those decision makers drive it. And regarding the auditing, we've also seen people use it for both internal and external auditing. And organizations that do both, actually, if they have these kind of structures put in place, they're able to minimize work by doing the same effort for both their internal process audits as well as things like their ISO certifications, because they require a lot of the same types of information in those dashboards and also in kind of like SharePoint repositories. So we have everything documented, we're watching through the performance, we have ownership, and here's all the rest of the information showing how we're executing it. Is there anything else you want to add about kind of the common applications, Melissa?
No. Let's go ahead and talk about challenges.
All right. So yeah, like we said, so the common ways people are using it is really to provide that structure, and also to help them identify and work through where they want to improve performance. But process frameworks in themselves they are a tool, so they also come with some challenges. So organizations also kind of struggle in certain ways for adoption and implementation, like I said at the beginning. So that's one of the big questions we also ask the survey takers. So where are you struggling? And as you can see here, there's, again, kind of three big buckets for where we see organizations struggle. The top two are kind of interrelated categories. So looking specifically at buy-in and engagement. So how do we get people on board with using frameworks? How do we get people on board with the process we're executing? A lot of the process efforts we do are fairly technical, you know, learning how to use tools, conduct mapping activities. A lot of those aspects are easier to learn, but we wind up kind of stumbling when we come to those people components. And the second big bucket of challenges that we see are alignment and purpose. And this is really kind of digging into how do we make sure the work we're doing is providing value to that organization. So how do we make sure we're focused on the right projects, that we're executing things effectively, and then we're also using the right measures to make sure we're showing that value to the organization as we go through it. And then the last one is kind of limitations of the framework. So frameworks are kind of an association of the most common elements. And some organizations struggle with, you know, some of the structures within them and how do they go about adjusting things and making edits. But a much smaller group of people are struggling with that. So what we're going to do now is focus on these top two areas, so buy-in engagement and alignment and purpose.
Absolutely. And as far as buy-in and engagement is concerned, it's no surprise that it would enlist organizational resistance, a lack of understanding of change management and executive level buy-in. With organizational resistance, it's really important that you use engagement tactics to make process work something that happens with and not rather to employees. And that really can happen through communicating what change needs to occur and its potential impact to the work that is currently being performed by employees. Another issue that comes up is just underestimating the amount of change management needed. Process efforts directly affect how people work, and we need to ensure that we make those take that people point into consideration. You need to consider the amount of change that will occur to mitigate something called change fatigue. If you've got the same people changing many different processes at the same time, they're going to lose interest and they're going to become overwhelmed. So that needs to really be taken into account. And leading by example, you need to have those people within the change environment that are championing those changes and helping people through changes. And that can be used through having training and tools and resources available to people during change. And the other thing that people tend to struggle with is the executive level buy-in. And what really needs to occur is to connect the purpose of the process work to the organizational goals. And in doing that, you need to provide a strong business case that outlines how process management aligns to existing strategies and goals, and give them real world case studies of what happens when process change succeeds and when process change fails, and really align them with that understanding.
I think kind of going on with that, some of the things we've seen as far as this kind of buy-in engagement is that process teams are really leveraging their SMEs for a couple of reasons to help kind of develop it. Also tapping into them to do some of the activities, understand the current state. I think one of the best examples that we saw of an organization who does this amazingly was Elevation's Credit Union, and they started from the ground up, from the beginning of the process efforts all the way to when they started developing the dashboards. They engaged people in a survey to help figure out what was wrong, so that people are using their voice to show them where the gaps are. They did some interactive workshops to help people then walk through how this work derives value, not only to the customer, but also to the different parts of the business and how they work together to get that value. And then they also use things like change agents. So they had they developed process experts within each of the different business units who worked as kind of like on the ground folks to help kind of drive some of those. And that last point you mentioned, Melissa, about executive level buy-in and that value, I think is incredibly important, and kind of then leads and ties into that second set of challenges that we talked about. So alignment and purpose, I think, is one of the biggest things a lot of organizations struggle with. And what we're talking about here is the first one is a lot of times we'll do process work for process's sake, or we don't have a clear-cut idea of what it is that's driving value in the organization. And if we can work closely with management team to understand what are those strategic goals, what are the big initiatives for the year, we can then help understand how process work kind of aligns with that. So a lot of organizations are doing digital efforts, or they're kind of creating standardization because they've grown up through acquisition. And by understanding what those kind of big drivers in the business are, we're able then to kind of focus in on showing that value, identifying what kind of measures we need to track our success so that we're showing that we're supporting them. And that'll help with that executive level buy-in. The other kind of big gap we see people is they don't have any pre-established goals for why they're doing the process work. Somewhere in the organization, they know that they need to do it. But this, if we understand, again, those strategic drivers in the business, we can then talk about what the focus area for our process work is going to be. Are we going to be working closely with IT for technology development? Or are we looking at streamlining things in the business, so we need to do that discovery work? And the kind of rolls down. So there's a kind of series of questions that, you know, process teams need to ask. And that is A, what is the big value, what the organization is focusing on? B, what can process do to support that? That then helps us then develop our communication and our points, as well as, so how is this going to affect the employees? How often are they going to get hit? And what's the value then that we can communicate to them for why they should be working with us? If you kind of tie all of those pieces together, it helps us with that engagement and that buy-in. The last kind of alignment and purpose challenge we see is that there's a lack of knowledge management for our process efforts. And knowledge management is really just finding the ability to take all the information associated with how people do work and collate it together. So making sure that people have their business rules for when they're executing their processes. Do they have the training materials? Do they have all their templates and forms they need? Do they have all the considerations they need as they're executing their work in those jobs? The best way we've seen people do this is by using a kind of a knowledge mapping exercise. We've got one that's kind of based and aligned with the framework. And really, it just kind of helps you walk through your processes to understand what information is vital to the execution of this work. Where does that information reside? Is it tacit information? Is this information in, you know, Joe's head? Or is it something we've already written down and made it explicit? How often is this information updated? Who owns it? And even more importantly, what is the risk involved with us not having this information? And what that does is helps you then collate and put together the information you need so that people have it when they're executing work. And that really kind of helps us move process from being kind of something that can be perceived as sitting on the shelf to something that's a lot more actionable for the organization. Anything else you'd want to add to these challenges, Melissa?
No, I would just like to say that it can't be overstated that communication and tools and resources are critical to make this happen.
Thank you. So we've kind of talked about the big common applications. We talked a little bit about some of the challenges, as well as some of the solutions we've seen organizations use. And then the next kind of the bulk of what we wanted to talk to you about today is, so how do we go about driving effective value within the organization as process management? And so in addition to kind of the survey summary, what we did when we were conducting analysis is we wanted to understand what practices and what behaviors actually improve the perception of process management effectiveness within the organization. So we ran some correlation analysis across, you know, the applications as well as the implementations, the types of challenges people were facing, where they fell, they were on a maturity level, what kind of improvement culture did they have, what kind of measures of value did they track, just to kind of help wrap our heads around that information. So effectiveness in a lot of ways is kind of a key measure for the impact of value and what people see as far as how we're doing. What we did see that, you know, over half the organizations actually feel that their efforts are perceived as effective or very effective. However, since we also saw those challenges around buy-in and alignment, we still think that people are kind of struggling with making sure that we're communicating the value and people are perceiving how they can use process management within the business to help them accomplish their goals. So that kind of led us then, like I said, to that next question, which is, so what factors are driving this effectiveness, and or what levers can we pull to make sure that we're delivering on what we promised to the organization? So what came up statistically significant, you can see here on the right, when we were going through and doing that analysis, the big buckets were applications. So some of the applications for a framework came up as, ones that are perceived as more valuable to the organization. What kind of implementation steps? So in addition to, adopting that framework, what other process implementation steps did they do at the same time for their work? What kind of measures and impact? So what benefits they found in process adoption, as well as kind of, do they track financial impact of their process work in general? And then finally, what about the organization's improvement culture? So how they approach process improvement also plays a really big driver in how they're perceived as effective. And due to limitations, again, we're just gonna focus on 2 of these. We do have the rest of the research, so if you guys want to dig in, you can see some of the more detailed pieces. But we're going to look specifically at implementation steps and that process improvement culture, because in a lot of ways, they're kind of at the core of what we do. So what we found when we ran the analysis was that there's kind of 3 major buckets of things that helped, as far as implementation steps, drive improved effectiveness. So it was kind of 10 different steps across these 3 big buckets of categories. So monitoring performance, so time measures and to the different processes and managing how those are executed. People who go about conducting specific improvement steps as well. And then kind of documentation and standardization. So how do we go about supporting some of that information we talked about in the challenges? As you can see, just come from the kind of visual ratio, monitoring performance actually has the biggest impact on perceived effectiveness for process management teams. So unfortunately, a lot of organizations, about 63%, don't actually conduct ongoing performance management as part of their implementation structures. This means they're missing out on a lot of opportunities because without having those performance measures tied together, they're going to undermine the value of their process efforts. Standardization and design alone sometimes are perceived as busy work by the business. Without ongoing monitoring of those process maps don't become actually actionable. But by tying performance measures directly to that, we're actually able to then monitor and shepherd our processes more effectively. The second big kind of mistake people make when they don't actually tie performance measures to the processes is that they're kind of impairing the objective decisions then about where their improvement opportunities are. So if we don't make improvement decisions with using measures, a lot of that kind of becomes then whoever yells the loudest, or we're doing reactive changes and improvements rather than kind of getting ahead of the game and making sure that we're doing improvements that are going to A, directly impact the business, B, provide value, or C, are ones that actually have a significant variance so that they need to be addressed. So kind of wanted to spend the rest of this time here talking about that monitor performance and what we mean by each of those kind of implementation steps. So the one that actually, if you look at the percentages here on this graph, that shows the improvement lift and the overall effectiveness. So one of the biggest factors is if you integrate process measures into employee performance, your effectiveness rating is going to increase by 23% typically. The goal here is that we want to tie the outcomes of the work people are doing directly to their performance measures. So again, we're talking about kind of identifying what are the right performance measures or productivity measures for the process, and then making sure that they're also shown on some of the reviews or on specific ones onto our employee scorecards. It has kind of 2 big benefits by doing that. First, we are connecting their efforts directly to the outcomes of the process as they execute. This also makes them accountable for some of the performance of the processes that they execute. And all this kind of helps build in buy-in for them when we're talking about change or improvement efforts, because their performance reviews as well as potential bonuses are tied directly to the processes they execute. They're more likely to be a little open to finding ways to improve the execution of those processes. The second kind of big place where we see in the monitor performance area is establishing enterprise-wide baselines. This is where we talk about the fact that, to be able to have a point to evaluate from, organizations need to level set and show where they're already performing in specific processes. And a lot of organizations tend to kind of struggle, or they jump straight to looking at improvement goals or ideas without actually kind of level setting with that information. And this helps us understand what good looks like in comparison for our organization. So it keeps the context that our stretch goals or our goals in general are within reason. And that helps make sure that, the promises that we make and the improvement business cases have the right kind of expectations. The second kind of biggest one is conducting ongoing monitoring. So a lot of organizations tend to kind of fall short. Well, a lot of people identify actual measures, so we've picked out what are some of the measures we should be using. Only about 60% of them actually kind of conduct ongoing measurement and monitoring of their process measures. Again, this kind of helps provide us some context by doing the ongoing monitoring. If we're only looking at the measures once a year, we don't actually have any contextual information about their performance. So we don't understand why there's a dip here, or if we saw that, these changes were made within the organization, we can understand what is that acceptable variance or why it occurred. And that helps us make better, stronger decisions about when to look for an improvement opportunity or not. And then kind of the last big one is by implementing some kind of tracking dashboard. So how do we go about picking through those measures to give them to the people so that decision makers can do that ongoing monitoring, as well as kind of making sure that everything's going right in their business. For Elevations Credit Union, the group I mentioned earlier, it wasn't actually until they built their measurement dashboards that they really got buy-in with senior leadership for their process work. That's because those KPIs included their target, as well as trends and variance. And that gave them the ability to then kind of drill in and understand when they needed to make decisions and how this kind of process work is impacting their overall goals in the organization. So improving processes and documenting and standardizations also have that kind of lift when we're talking about effectiveness. And if we look at some of these, it kind of makes sense. Determining a to-be state, a lot of times we'll start with just looking at the current state, but we also need to make sure that we're clearly outlining where we want to go when we're talking about this process work. And that kind of links back to making sure we have goals and are aligned with what the organization is trying to accomplish. Helping us benchmark internally and externally, again, provides some context for us to understand where we are and what good looks like for us, or what good should look like for us, in 6 months to a year. And prioritizing improvement opportunities goes back again. If we don't prioritize what we're working on, we don't really have any clarity to be able to help and support those organization goals. So a lot of process people tap into things like project management to help look for criteria, as well as kind of the structures they use then to show, this is the project, let's scope it out, here's the value that it's going to provide, here's the risk if we don't address it that it's going to provide. And all of that helps us make better decisions about what's important, what should come first, and what kind of resources we should apply. And then also kind of going back to that earlier challenge, organizations that help tie the information around the process by using things like knowledge maps or taxonomies really are able to then help provide that additional value by helping people execute their work. All right, anything you would add to this, Melissa?
No, I think you hit it perfect.
Alrighty. So the second big thing that I promised that we talk about that had really a large impact on the perceived effectiveness of our process efforts is actually our process improvement culture. So we kind of define process improvement cultures into 4 categories. The first is that there is no improvement. Once processes have been established, either through documentation or we've implemented them into some kind of technology system, we don't really have any structured approach, or we don't really make a lot of efforts to improve them. The second is kind of ad hoc. What we mean by this is process improvements are typically reactive. They're usually initiated by some kind of catastrophic failure or tied to some kind of larger change initiative. So that kind of just happen in the flow of something that's gone horribly wrong. And so we're kind of scrambling to make sure that we're solving a problem after the fact. The third one actually is what we call scheduled. And this is where there's a process review. So either the process owner or the process stewards of a kind of either an alert system or a calendar event to identify, review the processes to make sure the documentation and the information around them is still accurate. And also then collate any changes that have been made within the business and kind of adjust them, sometimes on a quarterly basis, but most often we see them happen annually, to where people then just kind of go through and do that check the box review. And the last one is what we call in the flow of work. This is where continuous improvement is kind of ingrained within it, not just the process owners, but also within the process workers. They've got empowerment and they've got the tools that they need to be able to logically kind of look for improvement opportunities in the flow of work that they're doing, and make those adjustments and work them with their process owners to understand if, you know, this is something that is a permanent change to a process flow, or if it was some kind of variance that we may need to take into account, or even maybe even a gap in kind of a business rule or something like that. But making sure that, you know, problems come up as we're executing the processes and that we're capturing them and making the solutions as they go along. So as you can see, when we're looking here at kind of the align, so again, the percentages are showing the amount of lift in that improvement culture, which is on a 5, the effectiveness was on a 5-point scale. And we see that as we go up to the more fluid kind of ingrained culture, overall perceived effectiveness is increasing. But when it comes to kind of culture shift, the majority of people are actually conducting ad hoc improvements. So they're reactive, or there's something that comes up, or they get tied to a larger project. So organizations can still see a big lift just by even shifting from ad hoc to scheduled approach. And again, that also kind of goes in the whole baby steps, right? Learn to walk before you can run. And we've seen some organizations do a really great job of the scheduled approach, and it works really well for them. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, they actually conduct quarterly reviews. So they have email alerts that are set up for all their process owners to go back and review their processes. And during kind of the initial discovery phase, when they're working with the process owners, part of the agreement that they sign is that they will conduct these quarterly reviews. The process team makes it easy for them by sending the alerts, and they've gotten, you know, kind of a checklist and a criteria for them to review each of the processes to make sure they're still a good fit. But they are held accountable for this. They're held accountable for keeping the processes alive and making sure they're accurate and timely. And that works really well for their structure. They're very project management driven. So that kind of scheduled review cycle works really, really great. But again, though this is kind of a step in the right direction, the biggest lift we saw is when we're talking about, you know, moving towards that continuous improvement culture mindset within the organization. And that's jumping up to 25% by organizations that kind of have this perspective. And this is, again, like I said, it's where we make sure that employees are engaged in process thinking and have the tools and are empowered to help identify those opportunities in the flow of work. There's a couple of different approaches that we've seen work really well. Some organizations kind of start instilling that process thinking by using competitions or using kind of hackathons and things like that to just start people thinking in that headspace. Elevations Credit Union also did a lot of that when they were starting to kind of build into their process work. So they created what they called OEIs, so opportunity, I can't remember. So opportunity games. So what they had was they created some kind of positive competition by having each department have a board game. So for one group, it was Candyland. For another one, it was Chutes and Ladders. And the whole idea behind this was to look for incremental improvements as they were kind of executing and standardizing their processes. And what that did was they had people engaged in the idea of improvement as they kind of executed through this work, and how they can kind of were able to then tap into it and give them the right skill sets. So one of the best groups actually is the struggle, well, take that back. One of the hardest part is moving them from that schedule to that improvement culture. And probably one of the best examples that I've seen is UPS. So UPS has actually had a really long history of being a process-oriented organization. They have process maps and opportunities for looking for improvements, and most of their customer-focused roles. I mean, even detailed down to, you know, driving behaviors and all the kind of regulations and desktop procedures for their drivers as well as their sort rooms. But what they really needed to do was kind of take a step back and look and see that there's a lot of extra demand for the organization to kind of reestablish process throughout all of the different areas. So what their team did was they started to rethink how they thought about process work. And they wanted their small process team to be able to focus on those larger strategic projects as well. So they felt they really needed to drive process and process thinking within the business. So they kind of overhauled all of their efforts. And one of the things that they did was they started getting feedback from people within the business to understand, so what it is about how we've done process work that works or didn't work for us. Some of the things they found out was that process jargon was getting in the way. They also found out that some of the training was cookie cutter and people didn't really find as much value in it as they wanted to. So they kind of took a step back and they built out what they call personas. So they started thinking about the people in the business differently because they had different roles. So they started looking at and building out, you know, based on what is their organization, what is their need from the process team, how much experience do they already have in process management work, and how much were they actually going to be leveraging within that. So their personas kind of broke up into, I think there was 4 or 5 of them, but the big picture ones that they did and how they kind of oriented their training moving forward and changed it was into 3 roles called process heavy roles. So that was for their process owners or their process execution teams, SMEs within the business, as well as their project managers. And they would do these intense 3-day workshops that were very applicable and hands-on, and people were encouraged to bring their projects in so they can then start using the tools as they're learning them into their everyday work. And that really helped reinforce and got them thinking about those process tools and how they worked. The second kind of big group that they had training for was their business leaders. So their business leaders didn't need to sit in and learn how to do process maps, but what they needed to understand was what was the value and what kind of services that the process team had that would be able to help the business leaders execute their projects and improve their work. And also, how do they go about working with those business leaders to kind of one-on-one help lift out and consult to figure out what those projects are, and how to identify the people they have within the business to help work and execute from the process perspective. And they also wanted to make sure that, you know, people who were new to process were able to kind of do some self-driven learning. So looking at that natural curiosity, they had their process light group or their process novices. So they created a bunch of training that was kind of webinars, self-service videos, all of that kind of giving them the introduction to the fundamentals, also introduction to some of the tools so that they can start understanding if it's a good fit for them, or at least an underlying knowledge about what process is and what improvements were. So that's kind of one of the big things that they did to really help drive the culture and move to that process culture. Like I said, they also kind of broke up their business and what they did. So, you know, their process improvement services were there to kind of help them address those problems. They focused on helping the businesses measure or kind of looking for potential hiccups in their existing processes. They developed a process center of excellence which is part of those things that helped empower their employees by giving them standard tools, the training efforts, as well as access to mapping tools and things like that that they needed to be able to execute the process in a standardized way throughout the organization. And then their process management team also provided kind of end-to-end visibility for their process maturity. And again, they kind of focus specifically on collaboration and empowerment with the business process management team. So all of these kind of help them focus on support and leveraging that kind of persona-based training to help employees embrace process, start internalizing it, and actively engage them once they kind of got their feet steady to help kind of start driving process work within their different business lines. So kind of the big takeaway from what we found from this study is that frameworks are still really foundational to our success. Frameworks are a great tool for any organization who's kind of wanting to put structure around how we accomplish work. They help people save time with their discovery and their documentation activities. But we still tend to struggle with the people side of process management, where we're talking about buy-in, engagement, and alignment, and looking at things like change management, identifying the value, are also some really big places for us as process workers to kind of look for and figure out what we need to do. But also looking at those drivers as well as some of the applications, the biggest gap that we see organizations struggle with is jumping the gap between standardization and developing out measures for our processes so that we can monitor and manage how people conduct work using that information. And all of this stuff that we need to do, kind of going in from that people side, as well as the measurement side, all of this can help us focus and work with the organization and develop that process-focused culture. Any other takeaways or insights you want to add at this time, Melissa?
No, ma'am.
All right. Okay, Maddie, do we have any questions?
We do. We've had quite a few come in, and I want to remind all of our participants for today's webinar, if you do have a question, please submit it in the GoTo question section of the GoTo panel, and we will get to it here in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here with the first question. What are the typical inputs for measuring process performance? And this is beyond auditing, within the context of the PCF.
Actually, within the context of the PCF, for measuring performance of the processes, so each of the PCFs actually, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Melissa, we include what are the common measures associated with the process element. So if you're looking at the PCF, it'll tell you what is either the typical high-level KPI, depending on what level you're looking at, or what are the productivity measures associated with those. And those are great ways then to help identifying the right measure for your process performance. So looking and identifying. So from a productivity perspective, we typically see what FTEs, cycle time, throughputs, as well as to an extent some kind of quality measure.
Spot on.
Okay. What is the next one, ma'am?
Thanks. We had one come in kind of tied to that. They're talking about benchmarking data. So how could we get benchmarking data about the internal processes?
You want to take that one, Melissa?
So yeah, APQC has a large assortment of benchmarks. You can get benchmarks on demand, or you can participate in surveys, and those are tied back to the PCF. So now that you've got you're utilizing your framework, you have a common language of processes, you can start benchmarking those processes. And one of those ways you can do that is through APQC's benchmarks. And those, again, will give you your KPIs, your performance measures, your efficiencies, your cycle times, your costs, all of that. And then you can take that and you can understand how how you're doing within your organization, but you can also start making decisions about how your organization sits with your peers in your industry, or even how other industries are performing, and you can find takeaways in that way as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving on to the next question we had come in. Their understanding is that typically you follow the order of process standardization and then move into process improvement. How do you think that's an appropriate order of events, or do you see it could go either way?
Honestly, I think it's the correct order of events, because you have to understand and standardize and document your processes to an extent before you go to improvement. So one of the things we've seen a lot of organizations do is start with improvement and then kind of run forward, which means they don't have a lot of the things that they need in place. So they don't have a governance order. They don't have somebody who's accountable. They don't understand all of the pieces that fit together. But that said, one of the things we've seen a lot of effective organizations do is while they're doing that standardization, they're looking for small improvement opportunities, or the quote unquote low-hanging fruit for improvements. And then one of the reasons why that kind of slight deviation is important is it because A, it's showing some quick immediate value to your SMEs. You're making their jobs easier right off the bat as you're going through the rest of the efforts. The other part is that it keeps them engaged, right? It keeps them in that right mindset as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Makes sense. And this question is tied back to sort of the beginning or middle of your presentation when you were talking about different buy-in and engagement ways to increase that in your organization. So they wanted to know if you had an example of any engagement tactics that they could use for process improvement.
Okay. There's actually a couple of them that I think that have worked out really great. The whole getting them started at the beginning engagement tactic that Elevations did was wonderful. So what they did was they took the banking process classification framework, and they created a survey. And for each one of them, I think it was down to level 3 processes, they asked them about, whether it was documented, if they just got work done, kind of a sliding scale of how organized that process was. What they then did was take that information and use color-coded Post-it notes in a working group so that everybody could actively see what they said about the processes themselves to help them talk through the value, help them prioritize which ones they needed to focus on first for their discovery and standardization work. So that was using their voices and then using them to come have a conversation around what was most important and facilitating it through the perspective of the customer. Another one we saw that worked out really, really well was another bank. They did a crowdsourcing activity. So they did a little competition because they wanted to make sure that they were capturing improvement ideas in the flow of work. They've been trying the whole kind of the typical check the box thing where we come in and say, okay, what are your processes? How are they effective? What ideas do you have for improvement? Who all is involved in that? And people were just kind of stonewalling them as far as kind of then giving them ideas. So they created, I think it was a 2 to 3 month competition where people got to submit their process ideas over a time period. The advantage there was that people were doing it in the flow of work. They incentivized it. I think the top 2 or 3 projects that came out of it got a gift card. They also came in, people got t-shirts for it. I think the most important thing though they offered from the incentive was that if you had an idea for an improvement and it got prioritized into the groups of improvement projects, you got to be on the improvement team. So because, this way the people felt like they were kind of behind the wheel, their voices were heard, as well as getting to steer what kind of solution was going to happen. So it was a great opportunity for them to engage people as well. Do you have any others that you would suggest, Melissa?
No, and that was a great idea they had.
Yeah. I think they had over 200 submissions from one part of the bank in just that short time period as well. So they were extremely happy with that results. Right.
That's awesome. So when you're talking about, and I think this is when you were on your implementation steps impacting effectiveness of process improvement and things like that. So they want to know, did you notice in any of the research that the levels of process maturity changed which drivers were more helpful in being more effective?
There wasn't, there's one definite correlation. So one of the things, if you look at a level 1 through 5 maturity for an organization, the biggest gap we see people get to a level 2, which is standardization, right? We've documented everything. We understand what it is. And to some extent, we've created some governance around it. So we put structure around work. But after that, the maturity levels start petering out for organizations, because the big gap there is then that performance group, right? So how do we then go about making sure that we're managing through processes and we're shifting how we think, becoming a process-focused organization? So I think that is showing up when we're talking about the correlation analysis with effectiveness, because most of it is that gap, right? Executing what we need to go from standardization to managing processes through data is the biggest change. And it also, as you kind of then go further up, building in that continuous improvement culture, as well as in kind of empowering people, tends to become more prominent as you go further up the maturity line.
Okay, thank you. And kind of tying to the difference in results that you saw in the survey, did you see any difference in the results by different industries?
Actually, we did not really look at any major differences between industries. We did not do a lot of data cuts by industry at this point in time, so sorry.
All right. Moving on to our next question we have. How do companies balance an empowered workforce to improve processes with documentation updates? Do most companies have a lot of SOPs, or do they let the process maps define those processes?
So this is kind of a two-part question. I'm going to start with the bottom part, and then I'll go back up to the top. So a lot of organizations do have SOPs. It really depends on the audience, right? So for your frontline workers, standard operating procedures, as well as desktop procedures, kind of getting into those lower levels are more important as far as knowledge for them. When you're talking about management or senior leadership, they're more interested in kind of those higher level process maps, or even the end-to-end processes or value streams. So depending on the audience, one of the things we actually saw really well was with University of North Texas, and this is one of those examples of using a framework as a taxonomy. So they kind of got their hands around all of their SOPs and stuff by identifying them by their process element. So they use that ID number from the PCF as part of their SOP to help kind of drive that structure. So then they could roll that up into the higher level process level for the management team, or they could roll it down into the flow of work for kind of those frontline employees and what they needed to do. Kind of the side note on that was that they also found that they had a lot of redundant SOPs. So they were able to kind of streamline it and then create that one source of truth for the organization. Now, going back to that balancing an empowered workforce with improvement in processes and documentation, that's where you need to have really good process rules and governance in place. So you typically need to have your process owner who's going to approve any major changes to the flow of work. And they usually work really closely with some kind of process steward within the business who has a relationship with the employees. So I think we did a project called Managing Project Knowledge. And one of the things that they did was to, anytime there was some kind of improvement opportunity or something like that that was flagged in their project work, is that got put into their lessons learned. It got put into their potential improvement opportunities, went over to their process owner to take a look at it and see if it needed to be just a one-time fix, or if it was something that was going to impact and change the actual documentation. So part of it is just making sure that, people can make variance changes as they needed to, but if it's anything, say, over a level 5 or whatever it is that level, the most down level your organization manages by, if it's going to change something at that level, and it needs to be vetted by that process steward and ultimately by the process owner. Okay.
Thank you. And Holly and Melissa, we're having a lot of questions come in since we've started the Q&A session, and I know we are running short on time. Holly, do you think you'll do a wrap up after the call to cover any unanswered questions that we don't get to?
Yes. So one of the things we'll do following on the call is we'll put together an FAQ from this webinar. So we will make sure to summarize all the answers to the ones we talked about now, as well as provide answers to the questions we don't have time to get to. I'll make sure to get that to you guys within the next couple of weeks, okay?
Perfect. I think we have time for about 2 more questions, so I'm going to jump into this one. This one is for someone who works at a smaller company where they don't have a lot of people doing the same job. So they want to know if you think it would make sense to work on process standardization first, even though it would be a very one-man shop type deal, or should they just jump into process improvement?
So even for that something that small, I think you should start with standardization. You should outline what you mean by you do with the work before you go into improvement. The reason behind this is because it gives you something to compare to where you're going to go and where you want to understand. I always am a big fan of the phrase that you have to know where you are before you can figure out where you want to go. So you need to understand your current state and where you want to go, and then jump into those improvement opportunities. The second reason I'd also make sure to get your standardization, at least some of your documentation done early, is it's going to save you a lot if the organization continues to grow and from a scalability perspective. So the earlier you establish this to begin with, the easier it's going to be for when you start hiring new people or somebody else takes on a role.
Makes sense. Talking about standardization, we did have one person ask, can you talk a little bit more about how you're using the term standardization as it relates to the PCF? Does this mean terminology, sequence of tasks? Can you maybe give a simple hypothetical of what type of standardization you're talking about? Sure,
actually all of the above. So from a communication perspective, as Melissa, I know you talked about this, is standardizing on what we mean when we're talking about specific tasks, right? Using the same terms when we're talking about work, that helps us make sure we're standardized and we can have conversations. One of the things, you know, my husband and I get into arguments all the time because we're saying the exact same thing, but we're using completely different words. And that happens in businesses too, right? You're talking about, you know, a specific area or a specific task, but you're using different terms. And that causes some problems. But also trying to standardize what are our components of how we're executing work. And the level of detail you get at in the standardization depends on the organization. You know, most people are just comfortable with going down to processes, so level 3s. We want to standardize across that. So then, you know, when we get lower is where we start to see more variation. But again, it depends on what your organization's needs are. So what are the elements of what we're doing and what flow do they happen in? What else would you add, Melissa?
So yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. Is standardization at its very root is just finding that common place that everybody can get on board to and understand is what's being stated and what's being done. And you stated it perfectly.
Okay. Do we have one?
Thank you. I think we're about out of time for questions. So Holly, do you have any next steps that you want to communicate to the listeners?
Sure. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your interest and your time. Like I said, all of this is based on research, and some of the stuff Melissa and I work together on also to help support PCF users in the organization. So you guys should be getting copies of the slide, and the bullets here are the projects that we've done this year and in previous years on supporting frameworks. So looking at the process frameworks in action, that's our most recent one, looking at kind of how people are conducting and doing all that survey summary work, as well as the full article on those drivers and the implementation, which is that second bullet there. We have another collection for our members that gives step-by-steps on how to use the PCF for different things. So how do you use it for current state assessments? How do you use it for end-to-end process mapping? Or even for things like risk management. And then putting the knowledge and the flow of work collection is really where process and knowledge management meet. And how do we put these things together to make sure that employees are optimally able to execute what they do? So stay tuned also. If you have a success story for process management or how you've used a framework, Melissa and I love talking to you guys. We learn so much from all of you and how you apply things. So please reach out at any time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks, Melissa, for presenting. And as we mentioned, there were a lot of questions, so we'll work on an FAQ document wrap up after this webinar and get that out to you guys. You will also receive an email within a few days that includes links to the slides and recording for today's webinar, so be on the lookout for that. And don't forget to connect with us on social media. It's where we post upcoming webinars, new content, upcoming events, and everything like that. So be sure to connect with us there. I want to thank everyone for joining us on the webinar today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.